Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome all of you to our webinar this afternoon on modern slavery and the hidden victims of the coronavirus. I'm Ann Nicol, Executive Director of the United Nations Association of New York, and we're very pleased to collaborate on this program this afternoon with Freedom United, the largest modern anti-slavery community today. UNA has been working with Freedom United since the fall of 2019, helping to promote their ILO Forced Labor Protocol campaign at the United Nations. Today, we'll have a fireside chat between two of our guests, Joanna Everett-James. She is the Executive Director of Freedom United and based in London, where she leads and supports Freedom United in combating forced labor and modern slavery. Herana Adisu is the Advocacy Officer and is based in New York City and works for Freedom United at the United Nations. After the panel, we'll have a Q&A. And if you look on the bottom of your screen, you'll see the Q&A icon, and you can write the questions while we're having the fireside chat. Our two interns, Zara and Carlo, will select as many questions as possible, and we'll try and answer all of them for you. And now let me turn it over to Herana Adisu. Herana, it's your turn to start the program.
Hi, hello, Anne. Thank you so much for having us here today to have this really important discussion and to speak about how individuals are being impacted by COVID-19 in the lens of modern day slavery. As you mentioned, I am the Advocacy Officer based in New York, and with Freedom United, we are one of the largest communities dedicated to ending human trafficking and modern day slavery. So to kickstart our discussion, I think it's really important for us to get a good overview of the issue. So I would move it over to Joanna. Could you give us an outline of how COVID-19 is impacting victims of modern day slavery?
Thank you very much, Herana, and welcome everybody. This webinar is entitled The Hidden Victims of the Coronavirus. And victims of modern slavery are often referred to as being hidden in plain sight. And that was before the pandemic, washing cars, harvesting crops, manicuring nails, in front of you, but the threats and coercion applied to force them to work remain hidden. So in this time of pandemic, when our movements are restricted and most of us are staying at home, victims of modern slavery aren't even in front of you. So what's happened to them? Is the pandemic having a positive or negative impact on modern slavery? Well, although we don't yet know the extent of the impact, we have plenty of evidence to suggest that the impacts are negative, and in three key ways. So firstly, the pandemic and measures to control it are increasing the factors that make people vulnerable to modern slavery. We know poverty, discrimination, and inequality make people vulnerable, and we're seeing lots of evidence that that's on the increase. So consider, for example, low-paid migrant workers in India who, without access to support systems, attempted to return to families in distant villages from the metropolises where they've been working. Without transportation or earnings, and with food supplies dwindling, their readiness to take greater risks can be capitalized upon by traffickers. Discrimination against migrant workers around the world is not uncommon. Combining that with the pressures of the pandemic often means they're the first to suffer. And the measures that are adopted to tackle the pandemic might be disproportionately applied. So take Qatar, for example, where Amnesty reported last week that COVID-19 screening is being used as what seems to be a smokescreen to detain and deport large numbers of Nepalese workers, some of whom have not received pay for their work. Young people locked into challenging home environments might also feel the pressure to run away, and the closing of support services means traffickers might get to them first. Quite clearly, there's a connection between vulnerability and the increase in those factors of vulnerability is likely to result in an increase in modern slavery. Secondly, victims of modern slavery and exploited workers are at an increased risk of COVID-19 compared to most of us. This is both due to the conditions in which they're living and the inability of them to be able to access healthcare for fear of deportation in doing so. For those who survive trafficking, who are in a country without legal rights or status, that's enough to stop them, as you can imagine, seeking medical help when needed for fear of threat of deportation. Now, Portugal is one country that's actually already implemented measures to grant all migrants in the country the same rights as citizens, regardless of the status of the immigration application. That's something that we're encouraging at Freedom United and calling on other countries to adopt. So yeah, cramped and unsanitary living conditions for victims of modern slavery, and also conditions in immigration detention centres where sadly too many victims find themselves. They're a hotbed of disease, for the spread of the disease, and make social distancing very difficult or impossible. We've also are aware of immigration detention centres in the US who are reportedly failing to provide detainees with adequate protection or even soap. So quite clearly, they are at increased risk. Now, the third factor is how this pandemic is disrupting our efforts to fight modern slavery. And that is in numerous ways, including our own Freedom United's efforts through our petition hand-ins, which we've had to cancel, through workshops that we've organised, but also other organisations in their work raising awareness. A partner in Kenya spoke recently about their community outreach work, which they have had to transition to SMS as they cannot go and visit communities. Another partner in Uganda talked about the challenges of keeping survivors safe in safe houses and preventing the spread of COVID-19. The criminal justice system has ground to a halt. So cases, prosecutions, and opportunities for victims to seek justice, as well as clamping down on perpetrators, has come to a standstill. There are many ways in which it's really affecting our ability to do our work, and one of the most prominent for many organisations in this space is funding. So in highlighting these three impacts, the increase in vulnerability to modern slavery, victims and survivors' increased risk of contracting COVID-19, and thirdly, the disruption to our efforts to fight modern slavery, I'm drawing upon Freedom United's campaigns, our news channel, as well as our partners' work. And I look forward to exploring this in more detail.
Thank you, Joanna, for giving us that outline of how this is impacting in very different lenses as we're navigating this new space. You spoke a little bit about vulnerabilities and increased risks, and I would like to dive into that a little bit more. It's reported that 70% of victims of modern day slavery are women and girls. How has this impact of coronavirus increased those risks for those individuals?
Well, absolutely. Well, one form of modern slavery which disproportionately affects women and girls is domestic servitude. In interviews carried out for a report on domestic servitude, the migrant workers spoke of having little to no food, working long hours without rest or days off, and experiencing delays in payment, underpayment, or even withholding of wages. So under these abusive conditions, women reported employers confiscating their passports, limiting their communication with family members, and even physically and sexually abusing them. Now, under this current circumstance of the pandemic, employers are home most, if not all of the day. And so in those circumstances, we can reasonably expect an increase in the oppression, control, and surveillance of migrant domestic workers, making the possibility of escape even more improbable. But it's not just domestic servitude. Another form of modern slavery that disproportionately affects women and girls is forced marriage. So as many families' income is cut and even wiped out entirely during this crisis, and particularly for those living on the breadline, such as those working in street trading, families are under increased pressure, and that might encourage them to push their daughters into forced marriage. We've actually seen this connection before with the impact of climate change, when it's damaged and disrupted income from farming. Families under pressure to manage their responsibilities to their children might be tempted to, and have been shown, certainly in the case of climate change, to push their daughters into forced marriage. Now, for those who are already in forced marriage, of course, this pandemic also affects them even more greatly than they may already be abused, for example, because their perpetrators at home all day. And we've heard quite wide reports about how the lockdown that's present in many countries is actually increasing domestic violence. And that's actually before we consider how it greatly reduces options to leave. So yeah, it's putting a lot of young girls in forced marriage and women at risk. And UN Women itself actually reported that intimate partner violence is a greater risk for girls who enter marriage in childhood compared to those who enter later life in any case. So certainly the COVID-19 induced measures will heighten the risk of forced marriage and likely also increase the rate of forced marriage. It sadly still remains quite high in many countries and is certainly present in nearly every country.
Thank you, Joanna. And as we're discussing about communities who are already at high risk, I think it's important for us to ask, how are marginalized communities such as the LGBT community and ethnic minorities who are already very vulnerable to human trafficking and modern day slavery, how are those impacts being increased as we're tackling this virus spread?
Yeah, it's an important question, Harana, absolutely. And just thinking about one group in particular, and that is young people in the LGBTQ community. They are really facing extra challenges in this time. Now we know, according to a study, that about 1 in 5 homeless youth in the US and Canada have been victims of human trafficking. So for these vulnerable young people, homeless shelters are a lifeline that they can turn to in desperate times of need. But because of the coronavirus pandemic and the resulting lockdowns, homeless shelters across the nation are closing. And many of the shelters that do remain open are at capacity, and they can't accept new intakes. But of course, not all homeless youth do get access to those resources. They might be using public places, finding shelter in schools or libraries or gyms, but these are all closed. So seeing that these facilities close their doors, it's going to increase pressure in a really unprecedented way on runaway youth and make them much more susceptible to traffickers and just to secure basic needs like food and shelter. But that's just one section of marginalized communities. Another that I think is really important for us to remember are those minorities who are disproportionately affected by the justice system and prison system. Now, unfortunately, there's been increasing evidence of forced labor being used in prisons, especially as the global demand for PPE, the personal protective equipment, and also cleaning products has spiked. And we've seen an example in the US of detainees who tried to refuse to work because of their fear of contracting coronavirus and the fact they didn't have enough equipment. They stopped and refused to work for, it was actually short of 24 hours, and the authorities called the police in, which the police found to be very disproportionate. In fact, I should say that, of course, in this case, the prison was reprimanded for its heavy-handed response, but quite clearly the overriding driver was to try and find ways to coerce these detainees into work and meet these demands. But of course, it's not just the US. The other big example that we've been hearing about recently and Freedom United has been campaigning on is the issue of people belonging to ethnic, cultural and religious groups in northwestern China, including Uyghurs, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz and Hui, who are currently the target of the largest organised detention of an ethno-religious minority the world has seen since World War II. Since 2017, over 1 million have been detained. And these detainees are made to work under constant surveillance with assigned minders and no freedom to leave. And this is forced labour that contributes to the production of goods for numerous multinationals. And of course, we know demand is very, very high for particular products, and China's obviously supplying those. And whilst I'm not seeking to make any direct connection between those pieces of kit and this forced labour resource, you can see how easily it could be that these two issues are totally interrelated. So I think that gives you a bit of an idea of some of how marginalised communities are particularly disproportionately affected.
Thank you. And you spoke about this a little bit on the overview, and I think we could dive in a little bit further, which is on migrant workers. We know that migrant workers that come from low economic backgrounds are more vulnerable to human trafficking and forced labor. How has this virus increased their risks as they're trying to travel home, as you mentioned in India, and expanding on how is this impacting them?
Yeah, absolutely. So I did mention it already, but of course, you know, that's just one example. And in fact, there are much more dramatic examples. For example, in Libya, where there are a lot of migrants and refugees that are fleeing conflict zones or fleeing poverty or looking for better opportunities, finding themselves actually trapped in Libya in some horrific situations, terrible detention centres, where slave markets actually exist in this present day. Now, for sure, the pandemic is increasing their risk, and that's in Libya particularly. That's because humanitarian operations have been suspended as a result of the pandemic. So that means suspending aid registration, resettlement flights, humanitarian rescue missions, and also off the coast of Libya, and UN visits to detention centres to check on what's actually happening. So yeah, I mean, sadly, forced labour of migrants and refugees is widespread in Libya, but not exclusively. So you know, the risk of exploitation is critical, and the suspension of aid and that oversight that the UN has on conditions is without doubt a massive concern. Yeah, I mean, I spoke about India already. I mean, it is a country with a very, very big informal workforce, where really people have just not got the access to kind of support systems that they might have in other countries, and trying to make those arduous journeys back from cities to home villages really can put them at greater risk. And we know that migrants who use irregular migration routes, and that's particularly thinking about cross-border movements, are known to be particularly vulnerable to human trafficking. We've seen it in survey data, which has shown us that many of these workers are at a critical risk of debt bondage as they take out loans to survive. Then in terms of transportation, you know, what we are seeing is reports that many workers are not being paid for the work that they've done because of the impact of the lockdown, and transportation is often limited or very overcrowded. So having to travel back home by foot, or trusting others, or taking out loans, you know, you can just see it's a toxic mix that could really create space for a trafficker to exploit. Then finally, I just wanted to mention farm workers. So we are running a campaign in California for farm workers who are temporary migrants in the US. And you know, we are concerned about the risk of exploitation. And you know, there are regulations in place, but they are weak, they are inadequate. Visa appointments that ensure that their status is regulated are being put on hold. So there's ample opportunity again for exploitation and coercion.
Thank you, Joanna. And before, this will be our last question before I move it over to our colleagues, Carlo and Zara, to take up some questions from our attendees. We're talking about all these gaps and vulnerabilities that are coming for individuals and already those who already have been trapped in modern day slavery. So what additional policies should be in place to combat modern day slavery as we are dealing with COVID-19?
Yeah, I mean, actually, this is a time of increased vulnerability. So to reflect and to mitigate those increased vulnerabilities, we should be seeing increased regulation. But unfortunately, if anything, it seems like it's going the other way, which is a real concern. So on gender, I've talked already a bit about how women and girls are disproportionately impacted by modern slavery, just as they are by humanitarian outbreaks like this pandemic. So we need to see policies and care packages that take into account how that disproportionate impact is on of the virus, how it has that disproportionate impact on women and girls. So yeah, really important that we have that gender mainstreaming and policy responses. And then access to healthcare. Now, I mentioned already that, you know, there's a real fear of seeking help from authorities because of practices, at least in some countries, of expecting the healthcare industry to report back to the authorities on immigration status. So, you know, Freedom United, we're encouraging governments to join the United Nations call to adopt measures to grant every individual, including victims of modern slavery and survivors, refugees, people seeking asylum, everybody to have access to healthcare free from the risk of detention or being deported. And that's particularly important in a period of a pandemic as we are in right now. So on ensuring that even the existing modern slavery regulations are actively implemented is really crucial whilst these quarantine guidelines are being enforced. So we need strong regulations that are protecting individuals from modern slavery and not seeing them suspended. I mean, it's clear, I think you can see from the example I've given, that the pandemic is creating, you know, a real risk, increased risk of modern slavery. So we need to really take this moment to strengthen regulations. And then on prevention, so one of the first steps in fighting modern slavery is to protect vulnerable communities and protect them from those means of coercion into exploitation and those vulnerabilities that put them in a position where people are taking perhaps a risk that they wouldn't otherwise take. So, you know, we want to see resources expanded for youth and women, housing, and those who are experiencing domestic violence, provide safe channels of transportation and legal routes of migration, both across borders and also domestically. You're giving people the facilities and the tools that they need to be able to travel home without you know, being put in a position where they're more vulnerable to the whims of a trafficker. We know for sure that, you know, poverty, of course, and the lack of financial support will inevitably just put you in a position where it's more difficult to avoid being tricked into being trafficked into forced labour. So we need measures that really get to the root of that and prevent it. We also want to see relief packages such as unemployment benefits extended to all persons regardless of their status or immigration status or work authorization status. And we've seen in Spain in the domestic worker industry some great initiatives to support domestic workers, but we're concerned that that doesn't extend to the most vulnerable and those who perhaps aren't working, you know, in a legal framework. So we want to make sure that, you know, the measures that are out there to support us all as we go through this really challenging time are available as well to the most vulnerable, to prevent them from falling into the trap of modern slavery and just seeing this whole problem of modern slavery grow and expand. And that's the fear. The fear is that at the end of this, we're going to see, in fact, a spike of modern slavery. I very much hope that isn't the case, but unfortunately we are seeing a lot of indications that that may well be proven to be the situation that we're facing. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Joanna, for sharing your insight on this, and for all the participants that are here, and to hear a little bit about our work and our coverage at Freedom United of COVID-19. I'll switch it over to our colleagues to take some of your questions.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Joanna and Harana, for sharing those insights. Now, if anybody has questions, if you could just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. And Zara and I, we are interns at the United Nations Association and Freedom United. We will take it in turns to read your questions. So to start us off, we have a question here from Tian, which is, do the panelists feel that a particular country might be setting a great example for the others to follow in terms of rules and regulations for the workers? And which country do they think would set the bars? Which country do you think would set the bar for others to rise to?
Well, I mentioned actually in my presentation, Portugal. I think Portugal's really taken a position that a lot of other countries would do well to follow in providing access to healthcare to all people within the country, regardless of their status. That's something that, in a time of pandemic, it just feels like a given that you'd actually be able to access healthcare. But the truth is, it's not like that, especially for people who are vulnerable to slavery and exploitation. So that is a really good example. So I think Portugal deserves to be held up as a country really sort of showing the way, and one that we would definitely encourage other countries to follow.
I guess just to chime in a little bit, I think it also speaks to countries that already have strong mechanisms against modern day slavery and those that don't. So I think it really tests the systems that are already in place to prevent modern day slavery before COVID-19 and how they're being implemented. So it's also important to look at those analyses and seeing which countries have to even start with have been battling this issue to begin with. A bit more of our partnership, as Anne mentioned a little bit earlier, we've been working with UNA New York here to advocate and push for the ratification of the Forced Labor Protocol. So this protocol really touches on the mechanisms to combat modern day slavery, which is prevention, access to remedies of justice, and also protective measures mostly for migrant workers to prevent them from falling into modern day slavery. So since the launch of our partnership, we've been working at the United Nations here headquarters in New York and speaking with different member states and collaborating to push the momentum for ratification. So since September, we've actually had 8 ratifications. In December, we had a roundtable discussion with the Costa Rica mission, where we organized a petition hand-in, as they are within their process of ratificating the protocol, so it should be coming in soon. And we had a roundtable discussion with the French ambassador and with Côte d'Ivoire earlier this year, as well as we're mobilizing to push for more member states to ratify. And to learn more about our campaign, you can access at p29.org, and you can sign up for our petition to keep up to date.
Thanks for that, Harana. Another question for the panelists: Do we have other examples to look to of maintaining the fight against modern slavery in a time of crisis? Are there other? Obviously, this crisis is unprecedented, but are there other examples of crises through which the modern slavery fight has been continued, and how did that happen? Are there any lessons we can learn?
Yeah, good question. That really is. I can think of some examples on a smaller geographic scale. Of course, this being a pandemic is as you say, Carlo, is pretty unprecedented. But certainly, we've been really working, we've been really concerned about the situation in Syria and how that's affected refugees leaving the region and finding themselves in situations of modern slavery, and that's forced marriage, but especially as well as forced child labour. One of the things that we campaigned for was a emergency funding for schooling, so to provide sort of a structure and a schooling system to support children so that they are less likely to be pushed and turned into forced labour. I think, again, this is interesting because it does tie to the pandemic in the way that schools have been closed and the kind of structure that gives, although of course the differences of displacement is not present as it is in the war. And again, that was a similar approach taken in Nepal following an earthquake, where we saw an increase in trafficking from Nepal because of the environmental disaster. So I think having some sort of structures in place that are institutional can be really helpful. Of course, a lot of those are closed now under the pandemic, and I think those are opportunities as well for people who might be victims to come in contact with frontline services, which is why a lot of the strategies have really been about how to educate frontline services to identify potential victims and provide the support that they need so that they can actually then,
It's really important to have legal protections for migrants, and it really shows that a lot of people fall into these loopholes, how Joanna have mentioned, for undocumented workers and migrants who are already vulnerable for human trafficking. And it touches even a little bit further on how it's important to have international mechanisms like the ILO protocol to protect migrants. So we will be referring to those documents as well as we're continuing to monitor COVID-19 in the lens of modern day slavery.
Thanks for that, Harana. Another question for the panelists. What can, obviously we're talking about what governments and officials need to do in order to protect modern slavery victims. What can everybody sitting at home do to help?
Well, we've probably got a few things that we could say on that. I mean, one of the things I also think I'd like to say is that, we're painting quite a dark picture. And of course, the whole pandemic in itself is a very dark experience for many people. But I think there's also an opportunity within it for positive change that, of course, we have to grab if we really want to make it happen. And that is about reframing and how the way that we do some of the things that, the way that we operate as a world and the way that our systems are currently designed and structured. So I am talking, in particular about how, for example, the garment industry has been affected. Now, it's actually really, it's a really, really serious and very devastating impact that workers in the garment sector who are providing untold quantities of clothing that nobody could possibly wear are now actually losing their jobs and not being paid because factories are not being paid for orders that they've made and that they've even sometimes shipped. Because retailers have nowhere to store these clothes. But perhaps it's a moment for us as well as individuals and consumers to rethink about our role and how that connects into the global system and what we can actually do to try and reduce pressures through supply chains. And of course, we're only one part of a big system. It's all as well about, I very much hope this is an opportunity as well for businesses to think about how they do business and what's going to be sustainable. And these are very big ambitions, but I don't think we should be afraid to, really step back and go, okay, what's important to us? This is a moment where we're really reassessing, our values, our personal values and relationships. And I'd like to see that really follow through in the way that, we treat other people outside of a pandemic. So we are thinking about our neighbours, we're thinking about people who are vulnerable, and sharing those values. But I'll pass over to Harana because she can give you some really practical ways and through, Freedom United, and that we've put together specifically to answer this question?
So one way we could take action is also with our Stay at Home and Take Action action hub that we actually have, which will be highlighted at the end of this presentation as well. It will take you about 5 minutes to log on and to sign our petitions as well. And that's one great way that you could stay active during this time. And it's also even logging in and learning a little bit of modern day slavery. I think one thing at Freedom United that we try to do is spread awareness. That's one key way that we're able to advocate for a change. So just educating yourselves on this issue and being able to articulate that with your colleagues and communities is one way that we could definitely take change during this time. And thankfully enough, these are all acts that we could take at home and something that we could do right after even this conference as well.
Real question that you really nail is the key one. Like, how can we actually reach these vulnerable communities? And I think at the moment, we're quite a long way from doing that. And if anything, we're probably a little bit further away than we ever were, precisely because there's so much focus on, our immediate circumstances. That's why for us, it's really important for Freedom United to keep talking about these issues, raising awareness, putting some light on the experience of vulnerable people, so that it's not lost. Their experiences are not lost amongst all the amazing amount of news that we're receiving on other issues.
Thanks, Joanna. Another question from Tian. What do the panelists think about the Australian government's information sheet on modern slavery and coronavirus?
I know this information sheet came out this week a little bit earlier, so we haven't done a deep dive analysis on it, but at a quick glance, it really touches on their reporting mechanisms that they already have under their Modern Slavery Act. So it touches a little bit of what we spoke about. Countries that already have mechanisms to combat modern day slavery are going to have a better response to the pandemic, since they already have better systems to fight modern day slavery. And one thing at a quick glance that I could also say that's really important is they touch on the need for support, not only for government agencies, but also for NGOs and civil society organizations that are working on the ground to combat this. One of our partners, and we've been speaking about as a quick example, is Runaway Youth, how there's going to be a lot of challenges for service providers and for individuals that are working directly with clients, for victims and survivors and those who are at risk. They are really having unprecedented pressure in order to provide these services. So there needs to be a support within governments and within all agencies to have these mechanisms to keep going and preventions. And I think it's really important, and Joanna addressed it as well. One trend that we are seeing is that regulation for modern day slavery, which is already very lax, is being loosened even more, which is the worst thing that could happen right now. So we need to keep putting on the pressure, not only maintaining legislation we already have, but promoting it. And that's one thing I think the fact sheet is promoting here, is making sure that individuals are knowing that this is still a priority as the pandemic is going. So at a quick glance, I definitely think it's a good step into maneuvering, or even having this fact sheet shows that this is part of their agenda of moving forward. So we just have to see how this translates over when it's going to be implemented on the ground.
Thank you very much for that, Harana. All right, I think we have time for one more question, which is from Kef. Says his wife and him would like to express their gratitude for their invite, and for the excellent questions and remarks, the positive exposure that you've given them as a member of the community is massive, and they're very grateful. So they just want to say thank you. Thank you very much to Joanna and Harana for those excellent insights, and I'll pass back to you, Anne.
Okay, again, my thank you also, Joanna and Harana, for this most informative program this afternoon. And thanks all of you for attending. And stay active in fighting modern slavery while you're at home by checking out the Freedom United Stay Home and Take Action Hub. And if you'd like to become a member of our chapter, you can find us on the web at unanyc.org, and we hope that you can join us. Next week, Tuesday, is our next program, which will be a film called Victors, and the program will be in the evening from 6 to 7 p.m. There will be an interesting panel discussion with the director, and also we have a special guest, the permanent representative of Uganda to the United Nations. And for more information on the film, please check out our website, unanyc.org, and we hope you can join us. So thanks again for today to all of you and to all our guests, and have a good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.